Strap in, everyone. We're going deep on ICOs. Initial coin offerings, those things. You sent over a whole bunch of stuff articles, your own notes, even some forum posts, all about ICOs. So clearly this is something you really want to get a handle on.
Yeah, looks like you're trying to figure out if they're the next big thing or just a big risk.
And you've come to the right place. We'll break it all down. We've got this guide from investing.com, which seems pretty comprehensive, plus all your own research and those firsthand accounts from the forums.
Should give us a pretty good picture, I think.
Okay, so for anyone who's maybe not as familiar, what exactly are we talking about when we say ICO?
Well, think of it this way. It's basically a way for crypto startups to raise money.
Bruh.
But instead of going to a bank or venture capitalists, they create these digital tokens and sell them. Kind of like a crowdfunding campaign, but with crypto.
Right. And the people buying those tokens, they're hoping those tokens will go up in value.
Exactly. Or maybe give them access to the project's services, or even a say in how the project is run.
And some of the gains people are talking about in those forum posts are pretty crazy.
Oh, wow, definitely.
Like, one person turned $500 into 10 grand in a year.
That's the kind of story that gets everyone excited.
But I'm guessing those are the exceptions, not the rule. Right?
Definitely more of a you got to be lucky and smart kind of situation.
So how does it all actually work, like step by step? How does an ICO actually happen? This investing.com guide lays out a whole 13-step process, which sounds kind of intimidating.
It can be, yeah.
But maybe we can focus on the most important parts for now.
For sure. I'd say first things first, you got to look at the white paper.
Okay, the white paper.
That's the document where the project lays out everything. What they're trying to do, how their technology works, who's on the team. It's their chance to make their case to potential investors.
So, like, if the ICO were a movie, the white paper's the script.
And the trailer and the director's commentary all rolled into one.
Makes sense. And you pointed out in your notes that it's really important to look at the team's experience. Is that something we should focus on right away?
Absolutely. You're not just investing in an idea, you're investing in the people behind it.
So it's not enough to just look at their website. Got to do some digging.
Exactly. You want to see if they've actually delivered on their promises before, if they have the right skills and experience to pull this off.
Okay, so let's say the team checks out. What's next?
Well, then you got to look at the tokens themselves, how they're designed, what they do, how many there are.
Right, because they're all different types of tokens out there.
Exactly. Some give you voting rights, some give you access to special features, some are just meant to go up in value.
So it's a whole world in itself.
It is, and it's constantly changing.
Okay, so we've got our team. We understand the tokens. What happens next? This is where the actual ICO happens, right?
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting.
So how does that work? Like, is it like an auction?
Kinda, but more like a limited time sale. The
Right.
project sets a time frame, announces how much they want to raise, which cryptocurrencies they'll accept.
Okay.
And then basically the floodgates open. Investors can buy tokens until they hit their fundraising goal or the time runs out.
And I guess that's where things can get a little crazy.
Oh yeah, it can get really competitive.
People trying to get in early, hoping to make a big profit.
Exactly, that's the dream, right?
Okay, so let's say I'm convinced I want to get in on the action. What do I need? Like, I've got my Bitcoin ready to go.
Well, first you need a crypto wallet. That's where you'll store your tokens.
Got it. So kind of like a digital bank account.
Exactly, but specifically for crypto.
Okay, and then I guess I send my Bitcoin to the project's wallet.
Yep, usually during a specific window of time.
And how does that actually happen? Like, is there some kind of middleman?
Not really. That's where smart contracts come in. They basically automate the whole process.
Okay, smart contracts.
They make sure everything happens fairly and securely.
So they're kind of like the referees of the ICO world.
You could say that.
Okay, so the ICO is done, the tokens are distributed. What happens then? Does everyone just sit back and watch the price go up?
Uh-huh. Wouldn't that be nice? It's definitely not that simple. The project team still has a lot of work to do. They have to actually build the product or service they promised.
Right, they have to deliver on what they said they would do.
Exactly, and that's where a lot of projects stumble.
So how do I know, as an investor, that they're actually working?
Well, reputable projects will provide regular updates. They'll be transparent about their progress, engage with their community.
So good communication is key.
Absolutely. If they go silent after the ICO, that's a huge red flag.
Right, like they've got my money, now they've disappeared.
Yeah, that's not a good sign.
Okay, so we've talked about how ICOs work today, but I know they have a pretty interesting history, too.
Oh, yeah. It's been quite a ride.
You mentioned it's a bit of a roller coaster.
A lot of ups and downs.
Yeah.
It all started back in 2013 with Mastercoin, the first ever ICO.
Wow, that's pretty recent.
It is, and it only raised about $500,000.
But it was like the spark that started the fire.
Yeah, and then in 2014, Ethereum came along, and that really kicked things into high gear.
Ah, Ethereum, the one that went from like $10 to almost 5,000.
Yeah, that one. It showed everyone the potential of ICOs, but it also attracted a lot of, let's say, less than legitimate projects.
Right, scams and all that.
Yeah, which led to more regulation and crackdowns.
So it's been this back and forth between innovation and risk.
Exactly.
So what does all this history mean for someone like you trying to decide whether to invest in an ICO today?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, and we've got a lot more to unpack. We need to weigh the potential rewards against the risks. Luckily, you've given us a ton of great material to work with, including that investing.com guide and your own research.
Yeah, I think we're ready to dive into the details.
Okay, let's start with the good stuff, the allure of ICOs. What makes them so tempting to investors?
Well, as we've seen, the potential for massive returns is definitely a big draw. But it's not just about getting rich quick. There's also the allure of getting in on the ground floor of something new and potentially revolutionary.
Like, you could be part of the next Ethereum.
Exactly. And that's exciting for a lot of people. And then there's the diversification aspect. Adding something different to your portfolio, something that's not tied to the traditional financial markets.
Right, so it's not just about making money, it's about being part of something new.
That's a big part of it for a lot of people.
Okay, I'm getting it. But now for the less fun part, the risks. Yeah, we got to talk about those.
We do, and they're real.
That investing.com guide doesn't sugarcoat things, and neither did those forum posts.
No, we got to be honest about that.
So where do we start?
Well, I think the biggest risk, honestly, is the lack of regulation. Compared to traditional investments, the ICO space is like the Wild West.
So fewer rules, more potential for things to go wrong.
Exactly.
And I know you mentioned the volatility of crypto in your notes.
Yeah, that's another big one. Even if you pick a solid project, the price of the tokens can go up and down like crazy.
Right, it's not for the faint of heart.
Definitely not.
But even with all that, there's still that part of me that's like, what if? What if I find that one ICO that takes off?
I get it. It's tempting.
So for someone like me who's intrigued but also cautious.
I think the key is to really do your research,
Okay, research.
like you're already doing, but even deeper. That investing.com guide has a whole list of factors to consider.
Yeah, we talked about the team already.
Right. But you also want to look at the technology, the white paper, the roadmap.
Okay, let's break those down.
Starting with the technology.
Yeah.
Is it actually innovative? Does it solve a real problem?
So substance over hype.
Exactly. You're not looking for buzzwords. You want to see something real.
Okay, makes sense. And the white paper, you called it the ICO Bible earlier.
It is. It's your guide to understanding the project.
So what makes a good white paper?
Well, first of all, it should be clear and easy to understand. If it's full of jargon and vague promises, that's a bad sign.
Okay, clarity is key.
Yeah, and you want to see a detailed roadmap, too.
Yeah.
Basically, a plan for how they're going to achieve their goals.
So it's not just about the destination, it's about the journey.
That's a good way to put it.
And what about the community around the project? I feel like that's got to be important in the crypto world.
Absolutely. A strong and active community can be a good indicator of a project's potential.
So are people talking about it online? Are they excited about it?
Exactly.
And I guess those forum posts you sent are a good example of that, real people sharing their experiences.
Yeah, those are valuable insights.
Okay, what else should we be looking at? What about partnerships? Like, if they're working with big companies, that's got to be a good sign, right?
It can be, but you got to be careful. Sometimes partnerships are more about marketing than substance.
So it's like, don't just take their word for it, do some digging. Okay, what about the token economics? That was something you mentioned earlier. Sounds a bit complicated.
It can be, yeah. But basically, you need to understand how the tokens will be used within the project.
Okay, so like, what can you actually do with them?
Yeah, and what are the incentives for holding them?
So it's not just about buying a token and hoping it goes up in value.
Right, you got to understand the whole ecosystem.
Got it. And then, of course, there's the whole legal side of things, which, as we discussed, is a bit of a mess.
It is, yeah, there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
So every ICO is basically a legal gray area.
Not necessarily, but it's definitely something you need to research carefully. The rules can vary a lot depending on where the project is based and where you're located.
Okay, so lots to consider there. All right, we've covered a lot about how to evaluate individual ICOs. But what about the big picture? Where is this whole ICO thing headed?
That's the question, isn't it?
It is, and I know investing.com had some predictions about the future of ICOs.
They did, and I'm particularly interested in this thing called security token offerings, or STOs.
TOs,
Yeah,
okay.
they're kind of like ICOs, but with a twist. The tokens are actually backed by real-world assets, like company shares or real estate.
So it's like a hybrid between traditional finance and crypto.
Exactly, and I think they have the potential to bridge the gap between those two worlds.
Interesting. So STOs are on your watch list.
Definitely.
Any other trends catching your eye?
Well, the rise of utility tokens is another one to watch. These are tokens that have a specific use within a project's ecosystem. Like, you might need them to access a platform or service.
So they're not just about speculation, they actually have a purpose.
Exactly, and I think that makes them less risky in the long run.
Okay, so STOs bridging the gap to traditional finance, utility tokens focusing on real-world use cases. Sounds like the ICO landscape is evolving rapidly.
Oh yeah, it's constantly changing.
Which is why we got to keep learning and adapting. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I think it's important to compare ICOs to the more traditional ways of investing. You know, like IPOs and venture capital.
Yeah, it's a good point.
It's like comparing apples and oranges, but they're all part of the same financial ecosystem.
They are, and I think it's helpful to understand the differences.
So let's start with ICOs. What are their advantages?
Well, as we've discussed, they have that global reach. You can attract investors from all over the world.
And they're relatively easy to set up, right?
Yeah, compared to an IPO, it's much simpler and less expensive.
But that ease of access also comes with some downsides.
Definitely.
Like less regulation, more potential for scams.
Right, it's a trade-off.
Okay, now what about IPOs?
Well, the big advantage there is the regulatory framework. You've got more investor protection, which is important.
But they're also a lot more expensive and time-consuming, right?
Oh, yeah, and they're usually geared towards institutional investors, not everyday people.
Right, so it's a different game altogether.
It is.
And then there's venture capital.
Yeah, that's where startups get funding from these big investment firms.
But it's pretty exclusive, right?
Very much so. You need the right connections and a really compelling pitch.
And even then, there's no guarantee you'll get funded.
Right. It's a tough game.
Okay, so we've got these three different ways of raising capital, each with its own pros and cons.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to see how they all interact.
Like, are ICOs going to replace IPOs someday?
That's a good question, and I don't think anyone knows for sure, but I think they're definitely shaking things up.
Yeah, it's a fascinating time to be watching the financial world evolve.
It is, and I think it's just the beginning.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from the basics of what an ICO is to the potential future of the whole industry.
We've talked about the allure, the risks, the history. We've even compared ICOs to traditional investing.
But as with any investment, it ultimately comes down to the individual. What are your goals? What's your risk tolerance?
And how much research are you willing to do?
Exactly, because knowledge is power, especially in the world of crypto.
Couldn't agree more.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I think we should address some of the common questions people have about ICOs. That investing.com guide had a pretty good FAQ section.
Yeah, let's see what we can cover.
I think it's helpful to go over the basics, even for those who are already familiar with the space.
Agreed. Sometimes it's good to go back to the fundamentals.
So let's start with a simple one. Why would a company choose an ICO over something like a traditional bank loan?
Yeah, that's a common question. And the answer is, it depends. For some companies, especially in the crypto space, banks might not be an option.
Like, they might not understand the technology or the risks involved.
Exactly. And for others, ICOs might just be a better fit for their goals.
So it's not always about choosing one over the other. It's about finding the right tool for the job.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, another question that comes up a lot. Are ICOs even legal?
The million-dollar question again.
It is, and unfortunately, there's no easy answer.
It really depends on where you are in the world. Some countries have embraced ICOs, others have banned them outright.
And some are still figuring it out.
Exactly. It's a constantly evolving landscape.
So the key takeaway is do your research.
Absolutely. Know the rules of the game before you play.
Speaking of comparisons, how do ICOs stack up against IPOs?
Well, IPOs are the traditional way for companies to go public. It's a well-established process, but it's also very expensive and time-consuming.
And usually only accessible to big investors.
Right. Whereas ICOs are more open and accessible to everyday people.
But that comes with trade-offs, as we've discussed.
Exactly.
So it's like choosing between the slow and steady route and the fast and risky route.
Kinda, yeah. And which one is better really depends on your individual circumstances.
Okay, so let's say someone's heard all this and they're like, all right, I'm in. How do I actually participate in an ICO?
First and foremost, research, research, research.
Okay, research.
Don't just jump into anything blindly. Take your time, read the white paper, understand the risks.
And if you're ready to take the plunge, you'll need a crypto wallet.
Exactly, that's where you'll store your tokens.
And what happens then? Like, how do you actually invest?
Well, most ICOs will require you to contribute in a specific cryptocurrency, usually Bitcoin or Ethereum.
Okay, so I need to have that ready in my wallet.
Yep, and then you send it to the project's wallet address during a specific time frame.
And then they distribute the tokens to my wallet.
Exactly.
And from there, I can hold them, use them, or trade them, depending on the project.
Yep, but remember, this is a long game. Don't expect to get rich overnight.
Okay, good advice. Now, another question that comes up a lot, are all ICOs legitimate?
Unfortunately, no. There are definitely scams out there.
So how do you avoid them?
Well, as we've been saying, research is key. Be wary of projects with unrealistic promises, anonymous teams, or poorly written white papers.
Okay, so if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the investor side of things.
Yeah.
But why do projects choose ICOs in the first place?
Well, there are a few reasons. One is that it allows them to raise capital directly from their community.
Okay, so they're bypassing traditional gatekeepers like banks and venture capitalists.
Exactly. And it also allows them to build a community from the ground up.
So it's like getting your fans invested in your success before you even release your album.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
And that can be really powerful.
It can, especially in the world of crypto.
So ICOs aren't just about raising money, they're about building a movement.
It's a good way to put it.
And that's what makes them so disruptive.
It is. They're changing the way we think about finance and the role of technology in our lives.
It's exciting and scary all at the same time.
Definitely.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone from the basics of what an ICO is to the potential future of the whole industry.
We've talked about the allure, the risks, the history.
We've even compared ICOs to traditional investing, and I think we've given our listener a lot to think about. So, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I just want to reiterate, do your research, be careful, and never invest more than you can afford to lose.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, now let's dive into some of those common questions.
Sounds good.
You ready?
Bring it on. It's like having the chance to be one of the first investors in, say, Amazon or Google back in the day.
Oh, I see what you mean.
It's that same idea of early access.
But in the crypto world.
Exactly.
Okay, I can see the appeal there. But we've got to talk about the risks too, right?
Totally. We can't ignore those.
And that investing.com guide didn't sugarcoat things. And those forum posts, some of those stories were pretty scary.
No, it's definitely not all sunshine and rainbows.
So where do we start? What are the biggest red flags?
Well, I think the biggest one, honestly, is regulation, or the lack thereof.
Right, because compared to the stock market, the ICO world is still pretty much the Wild West.
Exactly.
So fewer rules, more potential for things to go wrong.
That's the trade-off.
And then there's the volatility of crypto itself, which you talked about in your notes.
Yeah, that's another big one.
Even if you find a legitimate project with a solid team, a great idea.
The price of the tokens can still fluctuate wildly.
So it's not for the risk averse.
Definitely not.
But even with all that, I still can't help but think, what if?
Yeah.
What if I find that one ICO that explodes in value?
I get it. The potential rewards are definitely tempting.
So for someone like me, who's curious but also cautious.
I think the key is to do your homework. Really dig into the details before investing in anything.
Okay, research.
Exactly. And luckily, you've got some great resources to work with. That investing.com guide, for example, lists 8 key factors to evaluate.
Yeah, we talked about the team already, but what else should we be looking at?
Oh, the technology is a big one.
Okay, the tech.
You want to see if it's actually innovative, if it solves a real problem.
So substance over hype.
Exactly.
And then there's the white paper, which you called the ICO Bible earlier.
It is. It's the project's blueprint. You want to see a clear and concise explanation of their goals, their technology, their team.
Okay, so a well-written white paper is a good sign.
It is. And you also want to look for a detailed roadmap. That's their plan for how they're going to achieve their goals.
So it's not just about what they want to do, it's about how they're going to get there.
Exactly.
And what about the community around the project? I feel like that's got to be important in the crypto world.
It is. A strong and engaged community can be a good indicator of a project's potential.
So I guess those forum posts you sent are a good example of that.
They are. They give you a sense of what real users are saying about the project.
Real talk from real people.
What about partnerships? Like if an ICO project is working with a big established company, that's got to be a good sign, right?
It can be, but you got to be careful. Not all partnerships are created equal. Sometimes they're more about marketing than substance.
So do your research. Don't just take their word for it.
Okay, what about token economics? You mentioned that earlier, and it sounds a bit intimidating.
It can be, yeah.
Mm.
But basically, it's about understanding how the tokens will be used within the project.
So what can you actually do with them?
Exactly. And what are the incentives for holding them?
Right, because you're not just buying a token and hoping it goes up in value.
Well, you might be doing that too, but
Yeah.
you also want to understand how the token fits into the bigger picture.
Okay, so token economics is like figuring out the rules of the game.
That's a good way to put it.
And then, of course, there's the whole legal side of things, which, as we discussed, is a bit of a minefield.
It is, yeah.
No one-size-fits-all answer.
Nope, it depends on the specific project and where you're located.
So, again, research is key.
Absolutely.
Okay, we've talked a lot about evaluating individual ICOs, but let's zoom out a bit. What about the future of ICOs in general?
That's a great question.
And investing.com had some interesting predictions.
They did, and I'm particularly intrigued by this thing called security token offerings, or STOs.
STOs, okay, I've heard of those.
Yeah, they're kind of like ICOs, but with a twist. The tokens are actually backed by real-world assets, like company shares or real estate.
So it's like a hybrid between traditional finance and crypto.
Exactly.
And why are you so interested in them?
Well, I think they have the potential to bridge the gap between those two worlds. They offer the benefits of blockchain technology, like transparency and security, but they're also more familiar and regulated, which could make them more appealing to institutional investors.
Interesting. So STOs are on your radar.
Hey,
Any other trends you're watching?
Well, the rise of utility tokens is another one.
Utility tokens, those are the ones that have a specific use within a project, right?
Exactly.
Like you might need them to access a platform or pay for a service.
Right. And because their value is tied to their utility, they tend to be less volatile than pure investment tokens.
Okay, so they're less about speculation and more about real-world use cases.
That's the idea.
So we've got STOs bridging the gap to traditional finance, utility tokens focusing on practical applications. Sounds like the ICO landscape is evolving rapidly,
Oh, yeah, it's a fast-moving space.
which is why it's so important to stay informed.
Absolutely.
Okay, before we wrap up this section, I think it's helpful to compare ICOs to the more traditional ways of raising capital, like IPO and venture capital.
Yeah, good idea.
Because they all have their own strengths and weaknesses.
They do, and understanding those differences can help you make better investment decisions.
So let's start with ICOs. What are their advantages?
Well, as we've discussed, they offer global reach. You can attract investors from all over the world.
And they're relatively easy to set up.
Much simpler and less expensive than an IPO, for sure.
But that ease of access also comes with some risks.
Definitely. Less regulation, more potential for scams.
Right. It's a trade-off. Okay, what about IPOs?
Well, IPOs are the traditional route for companies going public. They offer a lot of investor protection and stability,
But they're also very expensive and time-consuming.
and usually only accessible to big institutional investors.
Okay, so it's a different game altogether.
It is.
And then there's venture capital.
Yeah, that's where startups get funding from these specialized firms.
But it's notoriously difficult to get venture capital funding.
It is. You need a really strong team, a compelling pitch, and often the right connections.
So it's not for everyone.
Definitely not.
Okay, so we've got these three different ways of raising capital, each with its own pros and cons.
And I think it's fascinating to see how they all interact and influence each other.
Like, are ICOs going to replace IPOs someday?
That's a good question, and I don't know if anyone has the answer, but I think they're definitely shaking things up.
Yeah, it's an exciting time to be watching the financial world evolve.
It is, and I think it's just the beginning.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone from the basics of what an ICO is to the potential future of the whole industry.
We've talked about the allure, the risks, the history. We've even compared ICOs to traditional investing.
And hopefully we've given our listener a better understanding of this complex and rapidly evolving space.
That's the goal.
So as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I want to shift gears a bit and focus on some of the common questions and concerns that people have about ICOs.
Good idea.
Because even with all this information, there's still a lot of confusion out there.
There is, and it's understandable.
So let's try to clear things up.
Sounds good to me.
All right, let's jump into those common questions. First one, and this might seem basic, but why would a company choose to do an ICO in the first place? Like, why not just go to a bank for a loan?
Right. Why all this crypto stuff? Well, for a lot of these startups, especially in the crypto world, traditional banks can be pretty hesitant.
I guess they're not as comfortable with the technology.
Yeah, and maybe they see it as too risky.
Whereas the people investing in ICOs, they're already into crypto.
Exactly. They understand the potential, and they're more willing to take a chance.
So it's like choosing crowdfunding over a bank loan, but for crypto?
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, another question that comes up all the time. Are ICOs even legal?
Ah, the legal question. That's a tricky one.
Because there's no simple answer, right?
Right. It varies a lot from country to country.
So it's more like, are they legal where?
Exactly.
Okay, so do your homework.
Always.
Speaking of comparisons, how do ICOs stack up against OPOs?
Well, an IPO is the traditional way for a company to go public. It's a much more regulated process.
But also a lot more expensive and time-consuming?
Yeah, and usually only big investors can participate.
Whereas ICOs are more open to everyday people.
Right. Anyone with a crypto wallet can potentially invest.
But that comes with its own set of risks, as we've discussed.
Definitely.
So two different paths, both with pros and cons.
Exactly.
All right, let's say someone's heard all this and they're convinced. They want to get in on the ICO action. What do they actually need to do?
First things first, research.
Of course, research.
Don't invest in anything you don't understand.
And assuming they've done their research, what's next?
You'll need a crypto wallet.
Right, that's where you'll store your tokens.
Exactly, and make sure it's a secure one.
Okay, wallet, check.
Then you'll need to have the right cryptocurrency ready to go. Most ICOs accept Bitcoin or Ethereum.
Got it. So have those funds available in your wallet.
Right, and then during the ICO period, you'll send your contribution to the project's wallet address.
It's like wiring money, but with crypto.
Kind of, yeah.
Okay, and then what?
Then you wait. Once the ICO is over, the project will distribute the new tokens to your wallet.
And from there, you can hold them, use them, or trade them, depending on the project.
Exactly.
But remember, this is a long-term game.
Don't expect to get rich quick.
Right, patience is key. Now, one more question that comes up a lot. Are all ICOs legitimate?
Sadly, no.
There are scams out there.
There are, and it can be hard to spot them.
So how do you protect yourself?
Again, research is your best defense. Look for red flags, like unrealistic promises, anonymous teams, or poorly written white papers.
If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Okay, so we've talked about why companies choose ICOs, why investors are interested, but beyond all the financial stuff, I think there's something bigger happening here.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, ICOs are kind of changing the way we think about finance, right?
They are. They're challenging the traditional power structures.
Like giving more power to the people
Exactly.
and democratizing access to capital.
Right. It's not just about making money. It's about changing the system.
It's pretty exciting, even with all the risks involved.
It is. It's a whole new world of possibilities.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored the ins and outs of ICOs, the good, the bad, and the future.
We've talked about the risks and the rewards, the history, and the potential.
And hopefully we've given our listener a better understanding of this complex and rapidly evolving space.
That's the goal.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I just want to say, ICOs are a powerful tool, but they're not for everyone.
Agreed. It's important to approach them with caution and do your research.
And never invest more than you can afford to lose.
Wise words.
So, to our listener, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you found it informative and insightful.
And we hope you'll continue to explore the world of ICOs with a critical eye and a sense of adventure.
Because the future of finance is being written right now, and it's an exciting time to be a part of it.
Absolutely.
Until next time, happy investing.